Today what I'd like to talk about is how the French and Indian War contributed to the revolution in the United States, starting with the timeline of 1754 and the outbreak of war, and finishing in 1776 with the official Declaration of Independence from Great Britain. So the French and Indian War in the colonies lasted from 1754 to 1763, and in Europe was known as the 7 Years' War, lasting only from 1756 to 1763. In this picture we see Benjamin Franklin's engraving, "Join or Die," with the 8 segments of the snake: South Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia, Maryland, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, New York, and New England. Not pictured are Georgia and the colony of Delaware, which was part of Pennsylvania until the Declaration of Independence. That engraving came out of a meeting called the Albany Congress in 1754, under which colonial leaders met to try and come up with a solution to the problem or the danger of the French and Indian territories, and there was little actual progress at the Albany Congress. In the early stages of the war, there were many French victories, and the British Army was not looking very successful, and as the British began retreating in many of these battles, there was some serious tension between the British and the colonists. The British Army felt like the colonists were unprepared and unwilling to fight this war, whereas the colonists felt like they were disrespected by their British leaders. Eventually, under the leadership of Prime Minister William Pitt, the British would begin achieving victories and would eventually win the war, as you see in the Treaty of Paris. In this map, we see the French territory of Canada and the Mississippi Valley. And with the Treaty of Paris, the French are going to be expelled from the New World, and you're going to see Spanish and British territories grow. With the Proclamation of 1763, unfortunately, the colonists are not going to be allowed to enjoy the spoils of war, and they will be limited at the Appalachians here with the Proclamation line of 1763. The reason for that is Pontiac's rebellion in 1763, the Native American uprising that led the British to fear any colonists going over the Appalachian Mountains and feared the cost of having to protect those colonists. So, in 1764, the British are going to pass both the Sugar and Currency Act, which are designed to raise taxes and revenues for the payment of both the war and the future protection of colonists against Native American incursions. This is going to lead to a lot of tensions in the colonies, but will also lead to the passage of the Stamp Act in 1765. This hated act would lead to the creation of 2 new groups within the colonies, both the Stamp Act Congress, which was geared towards fighting the Stamp Act specifically, and the Sons of Liberty, which was geared towards finding solutions to problems with Great Britain on the whole. The Quartering Act would actually replace the Stamp Act, which was repealed in 1765. The Quartering Act would force any colonists to house and feed troops that were stationed in the colonies, and led to much more tension between the colonists and the British Empire. The Townshend Acts in 1767 would further enforce the trade agreements between the colonies and the British Empire. The British began tightening down and enforcing their mercantilist policies and abandoned their policy of salutary neglect. This led to the creation of the Daughters of Liberty, who felt that buying British cloth was not acceptable, and they began a policy of home spinning their own cloth, similar to what Gandhi did in India 2 decades later. Eventually, this would lead to the occupation of Boston in 1768, as the British felt that Boston was unruly and needed to be controlled more closely. The engraving you see here is by Paul Revere, who was a member of the Sons of Liberty and an outspoken advocate against the British Empire. This is his depiction of the Boston Massacre in 1770. We see on the right-hand side the British regulars firing into a mob of helpless citizens, with the British commander giving the order to fire at the colonists. Conspicuously absent from this picture is the character of Crispus Attucks, who is the African American or mulatto seen in the picture here by Pelham. This is done in the same time period, but Paul Revere's became more popular because it was printed earlier and because printing an African American in a photo trying to, or in an engraving trying to unify the northern and southern colonies would have been problematic. In 1772, we begin to see the early forms of governments that are uniting the colonies in the committees of correspondence. These committees are designed to be shadow governments that are operating behind colonial legislatures, and they communicate amongst the colonies, not with the idea of independence, but with the idea of addressing colonial grievances. In 1773, the British, trying to save the East India Company from bankruptcy, passes the Tea Act, forcing the colonists to buy their tea from the East India Company. And while that tea would have been less expensive than the existing tea that they were buying, the British, or the American colonists, and those in Boston in particular, felt that this was unacceptable, leading to the Boston Tea Party in 1773. Notice that the Sons of Liberty here are dressed as Native Americans as they throw the tea into the harbor. Any tea that did not sink in the harbor, the Sons of Liberty went out the next day and poked holes in it to make sure that it sank into the harbor. Here we have Boston members of the Sons of Liberty taking a tax collector and covering him in tar and feathers and then forcing him to drink tea. In the background we have the Liberty Tree with a Stamp Act upside down, and in the back we have the Sons of Liberty dumping the tea into Boston Harbor. The coercive acts would be passed to close down the entirety of Boston Harbor, not allowing it to engage in any kind of economic activity. It banned town hall meetings, basically limiting the right to public assembly, and it reinforced the Quartering Acts, basically forcing the colonists of Boston to live under a curfew and live under constant threat of British retaliation. In 1774, we have the creation of the First Continental Congress, which was designed to discuss colonial grievances with Great Britain. Here we have pictured George Washington in the center, a man who was head and shoulders above the rest, was a great leader for the early governments. In 1775, we have the first major battle of the Revolution, though we have yet to declare independence. As the British began looking for Sons of Liberty who were storing goods, they marched to Lexington and Concord on April 19th, 1775. This is the famous Lexington and Concord, where Paul Revere did his famous midnight ride, telling people that the British were coming. And in 1775, we're also going to have the second meeting of the Continental Congress, this time still addressing colonial grievances, but also preparing an army, knowing that they are already in a state of rebellion against the British Empire. In June of 1775, we see another major battle, again this time in Boston, and this is going to be known as the Battle of Bunker Hill or the Battle of Breed's Hill. And though the colonists lost this battle and were forced to retreat from Bunker Hill, they did take a number of British troops and inflict a number of casualties on the British Army, therefore proving that this was a battle that they could win, and they could fight, and they could win. In January of 1776, Thomas Paine would publish his famous Common Sense, advocating for independence from Great Britain, as the Second Continental Congress was debating whether or not to declare independence. And on July 4th, 1776, Thomas Jefferson's famous Declaration of Independence would declare the colonies independent from Great Britain on the idea that a government was supposed to protect life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I hope you enjoyed the very quick tutorial on the French and Indian War up until the Declaration of Independence.